I want to step back for a second and talk about what the problem is that we're trying to solve. And this is kind of a cloud diagram of all the different types of actors that we have when we're talking about cybersecurity. Now, we start here, down here on the bottom right. Corporate users. You have all the companies that are engaging in economic activity. And they have huge vulnerabilities. They also need to be a large part of the solution. You have private users, individuals. These are us. We're trying to protect ourselves. We're trying to protect our own data. We have civil society, who needs to participate in all the regulatory processes that are going on, has opinions, and also needs to have its own rights protected. And then we have government, and we have two forms of thinking in government. We have government thinking from an economic standpoint, which thinks as a regulator, it thinks about dealing with the consequences of an attack. And then you also have government as a security apparatus, which is thinking about putting the bad guys in jail, if we're looking at it from a police standpoint, or about using military force to prevent attacks in the first place. And they're all interacting, and it's a crazy cloud because you have all these different people who are touched by this new problem, and there isn't a structure in place to bring it all together. And that's in any one country. In reality, we have this last bubble, international, which represents the fact that cyberspace is incredibly interlinked, and you can figure out the best set of regulations and the best structure in your own country, and it's of absolutely no use, especially if you're a small country like Estonia or Latvia, if it doesn't fit into a bigger framework. So this is a problem that we're trying to solve, please. And so the basic approach is that you have to, of course, focus on the government side. And this is the first 2 points. You have to have your legislation, your regulations up to date. You need to have some kind of a whole government body that coordinates everything across the government. So that's the IT Security Council in Latvia. Estonia has a very similar council that meets in the ministerial level. That's absolutely necessary, but that's not enough, because you also have to have really strong public-private cooperation. This is not like a normal security problem where the government can do it alone, where you can use the police or the military to solve the problem. If the private sector doesn't adopt good security standards, if individual users don't adopt good security measures, then the government's actions just aren't enough. It also means that the private sector isn't just talking back and forth with the government. You also need private-private partnerships. So a good example that happened pretty early in Estonia was the banks figured out, look, my bank is getting attacked and has cyber criminals trying to do fraud against it. Your bank is getting attacked. This isn't us competing. Like, it's not like if my bank has fewer attacks, I'm a better bank and the customer is going to come to me. We're both better off if we work together. So the banks realized very quickly they could compete over prices, but they shouldn't compete over cyber attacks. They should work together. And so that's the way we want to go, is we want to figure out ways, both formal and informal, to get people who don't usually work together, who don't share information, maybe who shouldn't always share information, to share it in this one area, please. So these are, I'm not going to go into the details, because this is sort of the Estonian strategy process that we went through, and the Estonian legislation. I think one point that's very important, though, is when we redid, we have an emergency act in Estonia that sort of defines what a national emergency is. When we rewrote that in 2009, we said a cyber attack could be a national emergency on par with large-scale rioting, on par with a big natural disaster, which is to say that we recognized that you have an existential threat to society in cyberspace, and we recognize that in law. And we then gave the government the legal means they need to deal with that threat on a very high level. And that's a precondition. You have to give government the tools when you have a high-level crisis to solve that crisis. Please. Thank you. So this is Estonia's national organization. And the point here, again, is that you have a whole lot of different ministries who all have to coordinate on all of this. And that, of course, is a headache for any bureaucrat, because bureaucrats are kind of like soldiers. They like clear chains of command. They like knowing what their role is, and that doesn't work in cyberspace. My agency, though, is this blue one here, and I'll talk about us a little bit in a moment, but the point is that it's very helpful if you have one agency that can talk with everyone and has a broad set of responsibility. So I talked about banks and telecoms. It's also important, the individual citizen is important, and Madis talked about awareness programs in Latvia. This is also something that is very important in Estonia, and awareness really goes from cradle to grave. So we have educational programs right now that start in primary school, where we teach children, when they log onto computers in school, how to behave properly. But we're going to go further, because frankly, this here is an incredibly sophisticated computer. If you have a child, your 2-year-old child is playing with your iPhone and has a sophisticated computer that probably has some of your credit card information, that could become part of a botnet, that could be hacked, you're not going to teach this child abstract thoughts about cybersecurity, but you are going to teach your kid maybe, don't press that link, press this link. So our current plan is to start in preschool programs. So the first time a child interacts with the state in school, we teach them how to be safe with network devices. On the other end is a high level of education. So all of our people who graduate technical programs in computer science have a module where they learn about information security. We have a master's program for quite a few years now on cybersecurity, so you have to do that too. This is a slide about my organization. I'm not going to go into the details, but one of the interesting points, as Modest mentioned this too in the reorganizations you're doing in Latvia, is that you have to give the technical people some kind of regulatory authority. So we restructured our organization last year, and what the restructuring lets us do is, so this is kind of this is the circle that you want to have when it comes to cybersecurity on a government level. This bottom thing, solving incidents, this is what a CERT does. A CERT is basically, we're talking about the Latvian CERT and the Estonian CERT, it's a bunch of geeks who are really good at hacking. And they work for the government, and if there's a problem in the internet, they get a phone call or they get an incident report that says that there's a problem in the Estonian or the Latvian internet, and they have to solve it. And that's really good, but that's not enough, because they see the same problem over and over and over again. And they see maybe that there's one government institution that has the same problem all the time. And they don't have the authority to go and tell that institution to change things. So you also need the authority to make rules and regulations, to take the information, the analysis you have of what's a problem, and make new rules based on that. And then you have to have the authority to go and see if those rules are being implemented. Now this is not Einstein here. I mean, this is how government works. It's how government has always worked. You find a threat, you analyze it, you come up with rules and regulations to deal with it, and then you make sure that the rules and regulations are being implemented. But what's happening right now is that in the course of a couple of years, we're applying this cycle that government's pretty good at in a lot of areas to an entirely new set of problems. And so when we talk about new institutions, when we talk about new roles, responsibilities, new funding, what we're really saying is that we're trying to take a model that works, which is the regulatory model of a modern liberal state, and apply it to a new domain where it hasn't been used. And we're trying to do that a lot faster than it's usually been done. You look at something like consumer protection, or you look at, say, regulation of banks. These are rules, procedures that have been worked out over decades. And what Estonia is doing right now, what Latvia is doing, what all the countries of the world are trying to do right now, is work out these rules and regulations for a whole bunch of new different areas of life, not in decades, but in a couple of years. And so that means a really fast pace of change. If you're a bureaucrat right now, it's really exciting because you get to do things in a couple of years that usually take decades. So for you students, if you want something related to policy that's really interesting, where things are changing quickly, this is where it's at. And it's going to be interesting for quite a bit more time. So this is the cycle that we're trying to build. No one's done it perfectly yet, no one in the world. I'd say that Estonia and Latvia, probably with the setups we have now, are ahead of pretty much everyone else in the world. You go to the US, you tell them about this. The US is a giant country with a huge system. They look at you with giant eyes and say, well, we're working on that, maybe check back in 10 years. And so that also gives us the right to go and tell others about what we're doing. I'm going to switch tracks for a second to talk about our Cyber Defense League. The Defense League in Estonia is a voluntary national defense organization. It's called Kaitseliit. So basically it's people who sort of volunteer to go into the forest on weekends, and they're a militia, basically. It's a paramilitary group. Now, we realized we had a problem in cyber, which is that we have all of these people who are experts in the private sector and the public sector, cybersecurity experts, and they know each other as friends. They go drinking together, but there's no structure holding them together. There's no organized community when we really want the state to actually be able to talk to these people as a group. And we want to be able to use them as a group if we have a crisis. So we took something we had already. We had this working structure with the Defense League where people would, take their Kalashnikov and go into the forest in the weekend and, practice holding back the Red Army. And we applied that organizational structure to a completely new problem, which was organizing a workforce, a volunteer reserve force in cyber. And that has worked pretty well so far. I'm a member of the Cyber Defense League. I don't have a picture of the logo here, but our logo, it's the standard logo of the Defense League, which is an eagle holding the national coat of arms. But this eagle is holding an @ sign instead. So it's kind of a melding of the 20th and the 21st century state. And it really, this is just, I know that Latvia is working on something similar. There's no right answer. The point is to take the structures you have, the models at work, and apply it to a new problem. The other thing, I'm just doing some advertising real quickly, that we have in Tallinn is the NATO Cooperative Cyber Defense Center of Excellence. And it's a research establishment that does a whole bunch of research on the legal and policy, technical, conceptual, and strategic aspects of cyber defense. And the center currently is 10 countries, including Latvia, and it's sort of one of the main scholarly centers of cyber defense and cybersecurity research. So, the Latvian there right now, Konrad-Adenauer, is a sort of relatively young fellow, but very bright. So we're very happy to have him. And I also want to talk about, since we've talked about Estonia, we've talked about Latvia, the international aspect. I think, Modest, we should perhaps sort of talk about this together. Estonia and Latvia have a very similar agenda. And we're very strong internationalists. I mean, we realize we're tiny countries that we have to work together on this. I'm actually going to start from the bottom, because I think the most important cooperation for all of us is the cooperation we do with each other. The Estonian SIT has 10 people. The Latvian SIT has 10 people. Lithuania is a little more complicated, but they don't have very many people. At the same time, you need advanced specialties. You need a guy who knows how to take malware, which is basically software that sort of hides itself on your computer and does things that it shouldn't do, and can reverse engineer it, can analyze it. So there are a lot of very expensive specialties where it makes sense for us to share those specialties. It makes sense for us to share very detailed information on the incidents that happen in our common internet space. And the same thing is true to an extent also for the 5 Nordic countries, for Finland, Sweden, Norway, Denmark, and Iceland. They work very closely together with each other, and they work closely with us. So you have to start with the people you trust. And all of these relationships are built on trust. But I think for us, I want to mention one thing real quickly, which is the Cybercrime Convention of the Council of Europe. We talked earlier about the threat, and we talked about how cyber criminals aren't just dangerous in their own right, but also because using cybercrime as a cover, states can do all sorts of things. So if you solve the cybercrime problem, it's easier to talk about crime than it is to talk about arms control, or it is to talk about stopping state attacks. You can actually make cyberspace as a whole safer. So one of the things that Estonia has been a very strong advocate of is everyone signing the Council of Europe's Convention on Cybercrime, and that sort of has you harmonize legal rules and makes it easier to extradite people and do things like that. And that's a good example of using rule of law and using institutions that we have to battle this problem. But the most important institutions clearly for us are NATO and the EU. Since Latvia has just gone through the MOU process with the CDMA, perhaps you want to talk about NATO a little bit.
Yeah, I can add something. So to start with why the international cooperation is important. The major point is that there are no margins in cyberspace. So let's take an example that we make the most secure country in the world, Latvia. But if me or Lucas would like to harm Latvia, we could easily, let's say, go to Estonia, Lithuania, to other country, and to launch an attack from that country. So it is very important to raise the security and the understanding of that globally. And currently, of course, we are working on the regional context. Also for Latvia, NATO, European Union are the major players. So it's good to have security in Europe, in the North Atlantic space. But what about Russia, Belarus, other countries? So if now, let's say, similar thinking of that, it's very hard to get something out of that.
Well, we'll talk about the Euro-Atlantic space a little bit. And the EU is really, we'll get back to the US in a second. The EU, I think, for any European country is a linchpin. Because again, we talked about all the regulatory problems, right? You know, it's everything from bank regulations to critical, I mean, all these different regulatory problems. Even if you could solve them on your own if you were a regular country, we're all members of the EU. And a huge amount of these decisions get made in Brussels. And these rules get written in Brussels. And this is frankly right now for us a problem. Because the EU, less so than any individual member of the EU, less so than NATO, hasn't really gotten it yet. There are people in the EU who get it, there are institutions in the EU who get it, but it's a big tapestry, and as a whole, things take decades to change in the EU. So this has been something that has been frustrating for all of us, because the pace of change in the EU is such that there are a lot of things that we could do where most European countries agree on them, where they're just not getting done. So this is, I think, the biggest challenge right now for us internationally, is getting the EU to have a common approach. And convincing, the trick also is convincing countries that don't want to give up parts of their, or that are very worried about their sovereignty, that these are problems we can't solve one by one. Convincing the UK, but not just the UK, is a real problem.